Hastings Ismay, the first Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, once quipped that the goal of the alliance was to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Today, the Soviets are out, the US seems here to stay, and the Germans seem weaker by the day. Has NATO achieved its goals? If so, why does it still exist? And why did Fidel Castro call it the most perfidious instrument of repression known to mankind? To answer these questions, we look back at the organization's history in Europe and beyond, and consider why a defensive alliance might end up causing World War III. NATO emerged in the wake of some of the most turbulent events in human history. The world was reeling from a global war, and the geopolitical balance of power was undergoing a tectonic transformation. The Soviet Union lost 27 million lives to defeat Nazi Germany. China lost over 20 million in a much longer war against the Japanese Empire. The British had been blitzed, their colonies starved, partitioned, and abandoned. Europe was in ruins. The United States, on the other hand, emerged economically stronger, and after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, shielded by the terrible power of the atom. It moved quickly to apply its newfound power to a project of global hegemony. Preponderant power must be the object of US policy, a State Department memo said in 1947. NATO was a critical piece of that puzzle. Founded in 1949 with the explicit mission of deterring Soviet expansionism and establishing a permanent North American presence on the continent. But NATO was not the only US military treaty signed after World War II, and the other treaties reveal a lot about the real motivation behind NATO's creation. These included the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or SEATO, and the Central Treaty Organization, or CENTO. Each was part of a grand strategy of economic and military encirclement and containment of communism. NATO insists that it's a force for democracy, but from its inception, it has armed, protected, and elevated some of the most reactionary forces in European society. In fact, the ashes of World War II had not yet settled in Europe, and the US was already busy rehabilitating fascists all around the continent. Antonio Salazar's brutal Estado Novo regime in Portugal was a founding member of NATO and remained a core member until it was toppled in 1974. Adolf Heusinger, a senior Nazi officer and close ally of Hitler wanted by the Soviet Union for war crimes, would become chairman of its military committee. Not many people remember the violence that swept across Europe in these years. Through initiatives like Operation Gladio, the United States funded what it called stay-behind operations across the continent, cultivating a clandestine paramilitary network ready to strike at and disable the rising popular movements sweeping Europe. From 1948 onwards, the CIA funneled tens of millions of dollars to extremist right-wing groups in Italy alone. These groups were responsible for scores of deadly terrorist attacks that massacred hundreds, many of which were blamed on the left. These, according to a 2000 parliamentary commission in Italy, were part of a strategy of tension that terrorized people into abandoning their loyalties to the rising communist and socialist movements, intended in particular to stop the Italian Communist Party, and to a certain degree also the Italian Socialist Party, from reaching executive power in the country. US activities extended far beyond Italy. The Corsican gang that led the French Connection, a notorious drug smuggling scheme that delivered most of the US's heroin, also received CIA support to prevent the rise of communist forces in France, as did Turkey's brutal Grey Wolves, and Portugal's Central Order and Tradition, and Greece's military junta. The list goes on. NATO's mandate derived explicitly from the threat posed by the Soviet Union and the rising popularity of communism outside of the USSR fell within its purview. As an instrument of US hegemony, NATO could not withstand the rise of an anti-imperialist politics within its domain. And the case of Italy reveals the indivisibility of NATO's process and the broader aims of US empire. NATO insists that it's a guarantor of freedom, but we don't have to look far back to find its fingerprints in attempts to crush popular aspirations for sovereignty. Fighting for liberation from Portuguese colonialism, the Bissau-Guinean revolutionary Amilcar Cabral described the weapons that flowed into Africa through the alliance, supporting the Salazar regime's wars against the people of Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Cabo Verde. NATO is the USA. We have captured in our country many US weapons. NATO is the Federal Republic of Germany. We have a lot of Mauser rifles taken from Portuguese soldiers. NATO, for the time being at least, is France. In our country, there are Alouette helicopters. NATO is, too, to a certain extent, the government of the Italian people. We have captured from the Portuguese machine guns and grenades made in Italy. If NATO was designed to stop the spread of communism, then the stirrings of sovereignty that rang through the colonized world would also come under attack. Pointing at NATO's support of the Salazar regime, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru condemned the alliance at the 1955 Bandung Conference, calling it one of the most powerful protectors of colonialism. Virtually the whole of North Africa was turned into a sphere of operations for NATO, wrote Walter Rodney in his seminal book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Time and time again, the evidence points to the cynical use of Africa to buttress capitalism economically and militarily, and therefore, in effect, forcing Africa to contribute to its own exploitation. That process has not ended. Today, for example, NATO's arsenal is wielded to grind away at the Western Saharan people's aspirations for self-determination, just as it arms Israel's genocidal occupation of Palestine. NATO insists that its goal is to safeguard its members, but it is clear that NATO operates in the interests of its most powerful member, the United States. When the US won the Cold War and the Warsaw Pact disbanded, it seemed that NATO's mission, too, would come to an end. In November 1990, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe adopted the Charter of Paris for a new Europe. This historic document, now largely forgotten, asserted that the era of confrontation and division of Europe has ended. It promised that future relations would be founded on respect and cooperation. But as Europe and the Soviet Union planned to establish a new security model across the Eurasian landmass, the US was preparing for a new era of hegemony. We can't let the Soviets clutch victory from the jaws of defeat, George H.W. Bush told Germany's Helmut Kohl in 1990. Later that year, he told France's François Mitterrand that no organization would replace NATO as the guarantor of Western security and stability. In this way, Bush set the stage for NATO expansion, against the so-called ironclad guarantees promised by US Secretary of State James Baker to Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze in Moscow in 1990 that NATO's forces would not move eastward of the German border. The motivations behind these moves became clear with the leak of the Wolfowitz Doctrine in 1992. Our first objective, the document said, is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere. The Wolfowitz Doctrine, which also laid the groundwork for preemptive military intervention, was later revised by Vice President Dick Cheney and General Colin Powell, and became the policy of President George W. Bush, leaving a trail of death and sorrow across the Middle East. But NATO was just as useful among its aspiring members. Take Poland. On the 25th of March, 1997, then-Senator Joe Biden arrived in Warsaw to address the conference of the Euro-Atlantic Association. In his speech, Biden outlined the conditions for Poland's accession to NATO. I believe that large state-owned enterprises should also be placed in the hands of private owners, so that they can be operated with an economic rather than political interests in mind, he said. Businesses like banks, the energy sector, the state airline, the state copper producer, and the telecommunications monopoly will have to be privatized. Membership in NATO thus dictated that states surrender the very basis of their economic sovereignty, while drawing them into the sprawling U.S. military-industrial complex through the purchase of NATO standard equipment. Billions of dollars are at stake in the next global arms bazaar, the New York Times wrote in 1997, citing weapons sales to Central European nations invited to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In one of its most blatantly ridiculous claims, NATO insists that it's a defensive alliance. But through the course of its history, NATO has destroyed and dismantled entire states. The Libyan War saw open-air slave markets reappear in a country that once had Africa's highest Human Development Index. In turn, Libya's destruction fueled militancy and conflict beyond Libya in Mali, Algeria, Niger, and elsewhere in the Sahel region. According to research carried out by the Costs of War Project at Brown University's Watson Institute, the post-9/11 wars that have been imposed on the peoples of Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and Somalia have claimed 4.5 million lives and forced tens of millions into poverty and involuntary migration. Many of those who then pursue the perilous path to peace are held up at NATO's borders, drowned in the Mediterranean, the world's largest graveyard, or disappeared into concentration camps funded by NATO member states across northern Africa. From the major US post-war military treaties, only NATO remains. CETO and CENTO are no more. One was disbanded when the US was defeated by the revolutionary forces in Vietnam, and the other after the Iranian Revolution. Yet NATO persists, not least because it's proven its repeated willingness to use overwhelming military violence against its adversaries. Now, having expanded as far east as it can go in Europe, NATO has set its sights on the world. NATO's recent strategic concept referred to Africa and the Middle East as its southern neighborhood. And at its 2023 summit in Vilnius, NATO issued a communiqué that doubled down on the organization's strategic posture outlined previously. China's stated ambitions challenge NATO's interests, security, and values, necessitating a NATO pivot from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You see, NATO is an anachronism. It emerged as an instrument of division and conquest, just as humanity was preparing to put violent domination behind it and welcome a new era of human cooperation. Principles outlined in the UN Charter, a document adopted with unprecedented consensus. Now, as NATO's expanding ambitions raise tensions to a boiling point on several fronts, it has become imperative to challenge its violent mission and dismantle the war machine. This is how we prevent World War III.